She was 6 months pregnant, standing alone on a frozen runway, watching the only man she had ever trusted disappear into the clouds. And she didn't even know yet that he had already sold her. Not her house, not her money, not her name. Her, to the most dangerous man in New York City. What happens when the woman who was traded as collateral turns out to be the most lethal weapon in the room? Stay with me until the very end, because this story will shake you. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The temperature at Hargrove Private Airfield dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit the night Vivian Mercer's life ended. Not her heartbeat, not her breathing. Those continued with maddening regularity, her chest rising and falling in small, controlled increments, the way her body had learned to function during the last 3 years of her marriage. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to itself. But everything she had understood her life to be. The brownstone in the West Village, the joint accounts, the future that had been constructed so carefully around a man she believed she knew down to the marrow. All of it stopped existing on that runway. She had her coat buttoned wrong. She realized it standing there in the wind, the buttons misaligned by one, the collar flipped up on only the left side. She had dressed quickly when Marcus called her. "Come to the airfield. There's a situation. I need you here." And she had come without asking too many questions because that was what she did. She came. She showed. She trusted. She was 34 years old and 6 months pregnant, and she had dressed herself wrong in the dark, and now she was watching her husband's jet taxi toward the runway with its stairs already retracted and its running lights burning cold white against a sky full of low-gray cloud. She didn't run. Her body understood before her mind did that running would accomplish nothing. The jet turned at the end of the taxiway. Its engines climbed in pitch, and then it was moving, accelerating down the strip, lifting away from the concrete with that effortless hydraulic grace that always unsettled her, the way something that heavy could simply decide to leave the ground. She watched its lights until they dissolved into the overcast and were gone. The airfield was very quiet after that. Wind pushed across the tarmac in long lateral sweeps. A fuel truck sat idle near the eastern hangar with its engine idling and its cab empty, the driver apparently gone somewhere warm. Vivian stood on the concrete and felt the cold working through her coat, the wrongly buttoned coat, and into her chest, and she pressed one hand flat against the side of her belly out of instinct, the way she had been doing for weeks now whenever something startled her. The baby moved. A slow, rolling shift, like something turning over in its sleep. She tried to call Marcus. The call connected to his voicemail on the first ring, not the second. The first, which meant the phone wasn't ringing. It meant he had sent her directly there, manually, which meant he had seen her name appear on his screen and made a choice about it. She stood very still and listened to his recorded voice asking her to leave a message. She didn't leave one. She tried his assistant. She tried his CFO, a man named Gerald Foss who had been at their wedding and who had once drunkenly told her at a Christmas party that Marcus Mercer was the smartest and most dangerous man he'd ever worked for, and he'd said it like a compliment. Gerald's line rang 8 times and went to voicemail. She tried the number for their household account manager. Disconnected. She tried to log into their primary banking app and received a message she had never seen before. Access suspended. Contact your financial institution. By the time the headlights appeared at the far end of the access road, Vivian had stopped making calls. She counted them as they turned onto the tarmac. 4 vehicles. Black Chevrolet Suburbans running without plates, moving in tight formation with the deliberate, unhurried coordination of people who had done this before and had no reason to hurry because they already knew there was nowhere to go. They crossed the airfield in a wide arc and came to a stop in a loose semicircle approximately 30 feet from where she was standing, their headlights cutting across the concrete and lighting her up from 3 angles. She didn't move. The doors opened. Men came out. 6, 8, she stopped counting, and arranged themselves without speaking, their hands visible, their faces neutral. They weren't pointing weapons at her. That was the first strange thing. Whatever she had been bracing for, and she hadn't fully articulated to herself what she was bracing for. It wasn't this careful, almost courteous stillness. The rear door of the center vehicle opened last. The man who stepped out was not what she expected, though she couldn't have said afterward what exactly she had expected. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", and he moved with an economy of motion that suggested someone who had spent a long time learning to waste nothing. Dark coat, no hat, despite the cold. His hair was black going silver at the temples, and he wore it short. His face was not handsome exactly, but assembled in a way that held attention, sharp features arranged around eyes that were doing something more complex than simply looking at her. He walked toward her at a pace that covered ground without appearing to rush, and stopped 8 feet away. "Mrs. Mercer." His voice was even, New York accent underneath it, but worn smooth over years. "I don't know who you are," she said. Her own voice surprised her, steadier than it had any right to be. Damien Moretti. She knew the name. Anyone who had ever worked in financial forensics in this city knew the name, the way you knew the names of certain weather systems, not because you'd experienced them personally, but because their damage was well documented. "Where is my husband?" she said. Not a question. She already knew it wasn't a question he could usefully answer. "On his way to Sao Paulo, last I was told." He said it without inflection, the way you stated a fact about weather. "He filed a flight plan to Buenos Aires, but his real destination is Brazil. We have good reason to believe that." The cold was inside her coat now, past it, working into her shoulders. "What do you want?" Moretti studied her for a moment, not the way men sometimes studied her, cataloging and weighing, more the way she had learned to study a spreadsheet, looking for the thing that didn't match, the figure that fell outside the expected range. "Your husband borrowed a significant amount of money from my organization," he said. $85 million in total, dispersed over 14 months in tranches through 3 separate intermediaries. The loan carried terms. One of those terms was Collateral. Vivian felt the baby move again. That same slow turning motion. "He listed you as the collateral, Mrs. Mercer. Specifically, not property, not assets, not equity in any of his business holdings. You, by name, with your signature on the documentation." He paused. "We have since determined that your signature was forged, but the contract is otherwise valid." She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved across the tarmac and the fuel truck's engine idled, and somewhere in the dark perimeter of the airfield, a security light blinked on and off with a slow mechanical rhythm. "That's not a legal contract," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "So why are you here?" "Because your husband is gone and my money is gone, and someone in this situation is going to bear the consequences of that. I came here tonight to look at you and decide what those consequences were." Vivian looked at him steadily. "And you're 6 months pregnant and standing alone on a runway in 11-degree weather because the man who was supposed to protect you put you here." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like recalibration. "I'm not in the business of harming pregnant women, Mrs. Mercer. That's not a line I cross." "Then what?" "I'm also not in the business of walking away from $85 million. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a phone, unlocked, and held it out to her. "Before you call anyone, there are several things you should know. The first is that your accounts have been emptied. All of them, joint and personal. The second is that your passport has been flagged. We don't know by whom yet, but the flag is current. The third, and most significant, is that the United States Attorney's Office has prepared an 18-count indictment against a corporate entity called Mercer Capital Holdings." He paused. "That entity's registered owner, as of 11 days ago, is you." Vivian's hand was still flat against her belly. "Your husband restructured his corporate holdings 11 days ago," Moretti continued. "He transferred the controlling interest in 7 separate corporate entities into your name. Those entities are the primary vehicles through which approximately $200 million in illegal transactions were conducted over the past 4 years. The federal investigation has been ongoing for 16 months. They have documentation, recorded communications, and 2 cooperating witnesses." He put the phone back in his pocket. "They will arrest you within 48 hours. The security light blinked, on, off, on. "I have a car waiting," he said. "You can come with me and we'll figure out what your options are. Or you can stay here and call whoever you were thinking about calling and see how that goes." He glanced briefly at her midsection, not unkindly. "I'll leave that choice to you." Vivian looked at the phone in her own hand. She looked at the 4 black SUVs with their engines running and their headlights burning and the 8 men standing in the cold with their hands visible. She looked at the sky where her husband's plane had been. Then she looked at Damian Moretti. "If I get in that car," she said, "what happens?" "You get warm," he said. "We talk. And I try to figure out if you're as smart as the people I had do background research on you seem to think you are." "What people?" "I had your history pulled 6 weeks ago, before the loan finalized. It's standard practice." He tilted his head slightly. "You were a forensic accountant before you married Marcus Mercer. One of the better ones, by most accounts. You testified in 4 federal prosecutions. You recovered over $60 million in hidden assets across 11 cases. You were very good at finding money that people were trying very hard to make disappear." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I found that interesting given what your husband was into." Vivian said nothing. "I found it even more interesting," he continued, "that he married you anyway. A man running the kind of operation he was running, marrying someone with your specific skill set." He let that sit for a moment. "Either he was very arrogant or he was very stupid. I suspect both." She buttoned her coat correctly. She didn't know why she did it right then. Some reflex toward order in the middle of everything falling apart. She redid all the buttons, top to bottom, and flipped the collar up on both sides. "I want documentation," she said. "Whatever you claim Marcus signed. I want to see the original. You'll have it tonight. And I want legal counsel present for any conversation that could be construed as incriminating." "That can be arranged." "And my medical records. I have a prenatal appointment in 3 days and I'm not missing it." Something in his expression did shift then, in a way she couldn't quite read. "That will happen," he said. She walked toward the center Suburban. One of the men opened the rear door without being asked. She got in without looking at any of them. The interior was warm, genuinely, almost aggressively warm, and it smelled like leather and something faintly medicinal, like the kind of soap you'd find in a hospital. She slid across the seat and sat with her coat buttoned correctly and her hands in her lap and waited. Moretti got in on the other side. The door closed. The vehicle began to move. Neither of them spoke for a while. The airfield fell behind them. The car turned onto the access road and then onto the highway, and the lights of the city appeared in the distance, glittering through the low clouds. And Vivian watched them the way you watched something you weren't sure you'd see again. "The indictment," she said finally. "You said the entity became mine 11 days ago." "Correct. What was Marcus doing 11 days ago?" "As far as we can tell, finalizing travel arrangements." She nodded slowly. "And the cooperating witnesses. Do you know who they are?" Moretti looked at her. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to tear apart what Marcus built, I need to know who else has already been talking and what they've already told the government. I don't want to step on existing pressure points. I want to find the ones nobody's touched yet." She turned her head and met his eyes for the first time in the warmth of the moving vehicle. "You said you wanted to know if I was as smart as your research suggested. That's a fair question, but here's mine." She held his gaze. "Do you actually want your money back, or do you just want to punish someone for taking it?" The silence in the vehicle lasted for perhaps 4 seconds. "Both," he said. "Then we might be able to help each other," Vivian said. "But understand something clearly, Mr. Moretti. I'm not doing this for you. I'm not doing it for your organization or your $85 million. I'm doing it because that man forged my signature, emptied my accounts, stole my passport, hung federal fraud charges around my neck, and got on a plane." Her voice stayed flat the entire time. That was the thing she was most deliberate about, keeping the flatness in it, keeping the tremor out. "And he did it while I'm carrying his child." She turned back to the window. "He's going to regret every single one of those choices," she said. "I'd just rather have resources while I make that happen." The city grew larger through the windshield. Damian Moretti didn't say anything else, but she felt the quality of his attention change, something sharpening in it, the way a room changes when someone truly starts listening instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. They drove in silence through the frozen city. What Vivian didn't say, what she held still and small and private in the warm back seat of the Suburban, was that she had recognized something 11 days ago. A pattern in the corporate filing she'd accidentally seen on Marcus's desk. She hadn't understood what it meant yet. She'd made a mental note and told herself she'd look closer when she had time, and then Marcus had called her to the airfield, and she hadn't had time. But she remembered the filing number. She remembered it exactly, because that was how her mind worked. Numbers stayed in it, fixed and precise, long after other things faded. And she had accessed the Shell Corporation records from her phone while she was waiting on the runway. She had recognized the structure immediately. She had seen it before, in a laundering case she'd worked 6 years ago in Chicago. The same layering technique, the same offshore routing pattern through 3-tier holding companies. She had dismantled that network in 14 weeks. She knew exactly how to find every dollar Marcus had hidden. She also knew something that Damian Moretti didn't know yet. There was a second set of accounts that predated the $85 million loan by nearly 2 years. Accounts that suggested Marcus had been planning this exit, specifically, deliberately, methodically, since before he had ever borrowed a single dollar from the Moretti organization. Since, in fact, approximately 3 months after he had proposed to her. The car moved through the dark city, and Vivian pressed her hand against her belly and felt her son shift and settle and breathe slowly and steadily through the understanding that her entire marriage had been a contingency plan. She had not been a wife. She had been an exit strategy. The question now, the only question that mattered in this warm car moving through the cold night, was whether the man sitting 18 inches away from her was going to be a resource or a threat, and whether she could manage the difference between those two things long enough to do what needed to be done. The Moretti estate appeared through the windshield as they turned off the highway, a stone-walled property set back from the road, lit from below, the kind of place that communicated permanence and force without any particular ostentation, the kind of place built by someone who didn't need to announce anything. The gates opened as they approached and closed behind them. Vivian watched the iron close in the side mirror and said nothing. Inside the car, in her coat pocket, her hand was around her phone, and on the phone's screen, still open, still loaded from the runway, the first page of a financial document she had not yet finished reading. The document was 37 pages long, and on page 19, she was almost certain, was the name of someone inside Moretti's organization who had helped Marcus structure the collateral clause, someone who had helped make sure she ended up exactly here. She needed to read page 19 before morning. The room they gave her was on the 3rd floor. It was not a cell. That was the first thing she registered when the door opened. Not a cell, not a bare room with a lock on the outside, but something that had been furnished with deliberate care. A queen bed with actual linen. A desk with a lamp that gave off warm light. Blackout curtains already drawn against the cold. A private bathroom with towels folded on the rail. Someone had put a glass of water on the nightstand. Someone had put a bowl of fruit on the desk. There was a small electric radiator in the corner, and it was already running. She stood in the doorway and took all of it in and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Comfortable rooms were not given to people who were going to be released. They were given to people who were going to be here for a while. The man who had shown her upstairs, heavy-set, mid-40s, dark eyes that registered her pregnancy and then made a conscious point of looking elsewhere, told her his name was Sal, and that Mr. Moretti would see her in the morning, and that if she needed anything during the night, she should press the call button on the nightstand panel, the one marked with a small white square. "Is there a lock on this door?" she said. Sal looked at the door. "From the inside, yeah. Deadbolt. From the outside." He met her eyes. "No." She didn't know if she believed him. She didn't say that. She said thank you and waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor before she closed the door and stood with her back against it and let herself breathe. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 out. She had learned the pattern from a cardiologist during a stress response workshop 8 years ago, back when she was working 90-hour weeks on fraud cases, and her heart rate was regularly doing things her doctor didn't approve of. She had never stopped using it. The baby pressed upward against her ribs. Not a kick. More like a slow, insistent reminder that she was not alone in this body, that her decisions in this room rippled outward in ways she didn't get to keep to herself. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She took out her phone. The battery was at 31%. She had not brought a charger because she had dressed in the dark and driven to an airfield and not anticipated. She caught that thought and stopped it. Anticipation was past. What she had anticipated or failed to anticipate was no longer useful information. What mattered was what she knew right now and what she needed to know by morning. She opened the financial document. It loaded slowly. The connection here was either throttled or passing through a monitoring filter, probably both, which she filed away as information about how Moretti ran his household operations. She waited. The document loaded. She scrolled to page 19. The name was there. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the mattress and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and stayed like that for approximately 30 seconds. The name on page 19 was Carla Donato. Vivian knew that name. Not personally. She had never met Carla Donato, but she had seen it before, in the documentation from Marcus's early corporate filings, 4 years ago, in a list of attorneys who had consulted on the initial structuring of Mercer Capital Holdings. She had noticed it then and thought nothing of it because she had not been looking for anything then. She had been a new wife. She now understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass, deliberately not looking. Carla Donato was also, according to a legal directory she had accessed 18 months ago for an unrelated reason, the primary in-house counsel for the Moretti organization, which meant someone inside Damian Moretti's own legal apparatus had helped Marcus construct the framework that named Vivian as Collateral, which meant either Moretti knew about it and was complicit, or there was a leak in his operation significant enough that someone had sold him out while working directly under his authority. Both possibilities were dangerous. Neither one allowed her to simply trust the man downstairs. She plugged her phone into the only outlet she could find, behind the nightstand, which required moving the furniture 6 inches, which she did carefully, one-handed, mindful of her center of gravity, and set an alarm for 5:30 and lay down on top of the covers in her coat and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of numbers. Moretti was already at the table when Sal brought her down at 7:15. The kitchen was large and working. Not a showpiece kitchen, but one that had been used seriously and recently. Copper-bottom pans hanging from a ceiling rack, a cutting board with the grain worn soft from years of use, coffee in a pot that had been going long enough for the smell to be fully distributed through the room. He was reading something on a tablet, and he didn't look up immediately when she came in, which she noticed and cataloged. A man who doesn't perform attentiveness. "Coffee," he said, still reading, "or I can have something else made." "Coffee is fine." She sat down across from him. There was a plate in front of her place. Toast, eggs, sliced tomato. She looked at it without touching it. He set down the tablet. "You didn't sleep." "I slept a little." He looked at the area below her eyes. 4 hours, maybe. 3, she said. "I want to ask you about Carla Donato." Something happened in his face. Not a visible flinch. More like a micro-adjustment. The expression recalibrating at a level that most people would not have caught. Vivian caught it. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "It's on the corporate structuring documents for the collateral agreement, the ones you said I'd have access to last night." She kept her voice even. "Her name is in the signature block of the legal review addendum." She signed off on the collateral clause as outside counsel. She paused. "She's your inside counsel." Moretti was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator cycled on. Outside, somewhere in the estate grounds, a vehicle was moving. She could hear the crunch of gravel. "I know," he said. Vivian looked at him. "I found it 3 weeks ago," he said, "after the loan default became clear and I had my own people pull the original documentation." He reached across the table and picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and set it back down. "Carla Donato has worked for my organization for 9 years. She structured somewhere between 30 and 40 contracts during that time. The Marcus Mercer deal was the 14th loan agreement she'd drafted. And the collateral clause was not standard language, it was custom. She wrote it herself. His jaw tightened slightly. Without my authorization, without my knowledge. You're sure? The look he gave her then was not friendly. Yes. Because the alternative is that you authorized a clause naming a pregnant woman as physical collateral for a debt you knew her husband intended to default on, Vivian said. And if that's the case, this conversation ends right now, and I take my chances with the federal indictment. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that had weight in it. I did not authorize that clause, he said. I do not conduct business that way. What Carla Donato did was a breach of my protocol, of my authority, and of a set of rules I have held to for 20 years. He set down the cup. She is no longer employed by this organization. Where is she now? That, he said, is something I'm working on. Vivian pulled in a slow breath. She ran 3 days ago. To Marcus. He didn't say anything, which was itself an answer. Vivian picked up the fork and ate a piece of the egg because she needed the protein and her hands needed something to do. The egg was good, seasoned, cooked properly, not rubbery. She noticed that in the detached way she'd been noticing small peripheral details since the runway, her brain insisting on cataloging the world even while the larger architecture of her existence was being demolished. Here's what I know, she said. Marcus didn't find Carla Donato on his own. He didn't have the connections to reach your inside counsel independently. Someone introduced them. She looked up. Who else knew about the Mercer loan before it finalized? 5 people in my organization. Carla Donato is one. Was one. The other 4. He studied her. Why? Because Carla helped Marcus structure a trap using your own contract mechanism. That means she had a reason to want your money exposed, your deal to collapse, and your organization holding collateral that would embarrass you publicly if you tried to enforce it. She set down the fork. She wasn't helping Marcus. Marcus was her instrument. The question is what she wanted out of it. She met his eyes. And whether any of the other 4 people who knew about this loan are connected to whatever she's actually doing. Moretti was very still. He had the quality. She was cataloging him now the same way she cataloged everything. She couldn't help it. Of someone who had spent years training himself not to react visibly to things that surprised him. But she could see it happening behind his eyes. The reassessment. You worked this out last night, he said. Parts of it. Some of it just now. She picked up the coffee. I need access to the full loan documentation. All 14 contracts Donato drafted, not just the Mercer one. I need the original financial communication logs between Marcus and your organization from the first contact point. And I need whatever you have on Donato's personal financial history going back 5 years. Why 5 years? Because that's approximately when the accounts I found in the corporate filings started moving. The ones Marcus has been building his exit fund in. She paused. There are 2 sets of accounts, Mr. Moretti. Your $85 million is in one of them, but there's a second pool. Money that predates his relationship with your organization by almost 2 years. I believe that money came from someone else. Someone who funded Marcus's operation early and helped him set up your organization as the vehicle he'd eventually default to. So the blame and the legal exposure would land on whoever he'd named as collateral. She let that settle. Which was supposed to be me. The gravel outside had gone quiet. Moretti was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely name, somewhere between calculation and something more unguarded that he was actively suppressing. You're saying Marcus was a front, he said. I'm saying Marcus was ambitious and greedy and not as smart as he thought he was. And I'm saying someone smarter than him used that. Yes. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I don't know yet who. That's what I need the documents for. He stood up, went to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets looking out at the grounds, his back to her. And she watched him and waited and did not speak because some silences were working silences and interrupting them was counterproductive. If I give you access to those records, he said to the window, you'll see parts of my organization I don't show to people outside it. I understand that. And if you ever use that access in a way that harms my interests, I won't, she said. Not because I owe you anything, but because whoever set this up harmed my interests first, and finding them requires going through the same material. She paused. I have a son coming in approximately 3 months. I need to not be under federal indictment when he arrives. I need the charges cleared. I need assets I can live on. And I need the man who forged my signature and put me on that runway to feel the specific and total weight of what he did. Her voice stayed flat all the way through. That requires resources I don't currently have. You have them. So let's stop deciding whether to trust each other and start deciding how to be useful to each other. Those are different conversations. He turned around. He looked at her for a long time. Sal, he said, raising his voice slightly. Sal appeared from somewhere outside the kitchen doorway with the speed of someone who had been nearby and listening, which she had assumed. Set her up in the East office. Full document access, secured terminal, whatever she needs. He looked at Vivian. You'll have everything by 9. The East office was smaller than she expected. A room clearly used for actual work rather than meetings. The desk surface scuffed at the edges. The chair adjusted for someone taller. A whiteboard on one wall with something half erased that she didn't look at closely. Sal brought in a laptop, then a second monitor, then a portable hard drive, then a legal pad and 3 pens, then stood in the doorway looking uncertain. You need anything else right now, he said. A charger that fits this phone. He produced one from his jacket pocket without comment, which told her someone had checked her phone model overnight. She plugged in. She opened the first file. It took her 40 minutes to understand what she was looking at, and another 20 to confirm it. And when she confirmed it, she sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and felt something settle in her chest that was not relief and not anger and was not quite anything she had a clean word for. The 14 contracts Carla Donato had drafted over 9 years showed a pattern that was almost elegant in its patience. The first 11 were clean, standard loan agreements, properly structured, with conventional collateral clauses that referenced property and equity. Exactly what you'd expect. The 12th contract, drafted 22 months ago, introduced a minor variation in the collateral language. The 13th contract expanded it. The 14th, the Mercer contract, was the completion of a framework that had been built incrementally across 2 years, each step normalized by the one before it. Carla Donato had not drafted a bad contract for Marcus Mercer. She had spent 2 years rewriting what a contract could mean inside the Moretti organization, one document at a time, so that when the Mercer clause appeared, it would look like an extension of established practice rather than an aberration. The implication was staggering in its patience and appalling in its precision. Vivian was on her 3rd page of handwritten notes when the door opened without a knock. The man who came in was not Sal. He was younger than Moretti by perhaps a decade, with the same dark coloring but sharper through the jaw, and wearing it differently. Where Moretti carried himself with a kind of settled gravity, this man had something restless in him, a quality of stored energy looking for an exit. He looked at her with something that was not quite hostility and not quite curiosity, and landed somewhere between them. "You're the wife," he said. "I'm Vivian Mercer," she said, without looking up from the legal pad. "Marco Moretti." He came further into the room without being invited. "Damien's brother." She looked up then. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, studying her the way you'd study something that had appeared somewhere unexpected. "Damien told me what you said at breakfast." "Which part?" "The part about a second set of accounts. The part about someone using your husband as a front." His eyes moved to the document spread across the desk. "He believes you." "I know." "I don't." Vivian set down the pen. "Okay. You show up with a pregnant belly and a story about being betrayed, and my brother opens up his entire document archive to you inside of 12 hours. Something tightened around his eyes. "That's not caution. That's a liability. Your brother makes his own decisions." "Yeah, he does. That's the problem." He pushed off the wall. "I've been in this organization since I was 19 years old. I have spent 15 years watching people try to get close to Damien through every angle imaginable. And in 15 years, I have never seen him move that fast." He stopped at the edge of the desk. "So I want to know what you're actually doing here." Vivian looked at him steadily. He was genuinely worried, she registered. Not performatively territorial, not posturing. Actually worried. About his brother. That was information. I'm doing exactly what I told him I was doing, she said. I'm pulling apart the financial architecture of a fraud operation that my husband built on my name without my knowledge. If that process helps your organization recover its money, that's an alignment of interests, not a manipulation. She picked up the pen again. You can stay and watch if that makes you feel better. I'm not hiding what I'm doing. He looked at the documents. Despite himself, his eyes moved across the page closest to him. She watched it happen, the reflexive parsing. You found something, he said. Several things. What? Carla Donato built this over 2 years, she said. She didn't just help Marcus. She restructured the contract language inside your organization systematically across 12 documents so that the clause she needed would look like precedent when she used it. That takes time and patience and a very specific goal. She paused. I don't think she did it for money. I think she did it for someone who has something on her, or someone she's protecting. She looked at Marco. Does she have family? He was quiet for a moment. Then, a brother. Younger. He was in some trouble 2 years ago. Financial, not criminal. Someone bailed him out. We never found out who. Vivian wrote that down. 2 years ago, she said. Approximately. That's when the contract language started changing. Marco looked at the legal pad. He looked at her. The restless energy in him shifted, not gone, but reorganized around something. What do you need? He said. It came out slightly grudgingly, like a door being opened that he'd been trying to keep shut. I need to know who bailed out Carla Donato's brother, she said. I need a name. I can find that. Then find it. She turned back to the documents. And close the door on your way out. He stood there for another 2 seconds. She could feel it without looking. Then his footsteps crossed the room and the door closed behind him, not loudly, but with the particular emphasis of someone making a small point. She exhaled. She wrote 3 more lines of notes. Then she turned back to the hard drive and opened the second partition, the one labeled with a date string she'd noticed earlier, a folder that corresponded to the first month of Marcus's loan application. She navigated through the subfolder structure and found what she was looking for in the 6th directory. Communication logs. Encrypted originally, but already decrypted by Moretti's technical people for internal review. She began reading. 40 minutes later, her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it. It buzzed again. She answered. Vivian. Marcus's voice. She recognized it with a physical response she hadn't anticipated. Something in her chest and stomach that was not love and not grief, and was not entirely cold either. Something complicated and human and unwanted. I know where you are. She said nothing. I need you to listen to me, he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something under it, a quality of something compressed and pressurized. I know what you're doing. I know what you're looking for in those files. And I need you to stop before you find something that makes this situation irreversible. Marcus. Vivian, you put my name on an indictment, she said. You forged my signature on a criminal contract. You emptied our accounts. You took my passport. And you left me on a runway in the cold while I'm 6 months pregnant with your son. Her voice stayed controlled, flat. She had promised herself she would keep it flat, and she kept that promise. Give me one reason why I should stop. The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Because what you're about to find, Marcus said, is going to put you in more danger than you're already in, and the man sitting in that house with you is not who he's told you he is. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. On the laptop screen in front of her, the communication log she'd been reading was still open. She had stopped 3 paragraphs from the end when her phone rang. Now her eyes moved back to it. She read the last 3 paragraphs, and she understood what Marcus was trying to stop her from finding. Because it was already too late. The name at the bottom of the final communication, the person who had made initial contact with Marcus, who had introduced him to the Moretti organization's lending structure, who had told him exactly how to use Carla Donato and exactly what collateral to name and exactly when to run, was not Carla Donato. It was not anyone from Marcus's world. The name at the bottom of that communication log was one she recognized from a different context entirely. From a federal case file she had worked 7 years ago, a money laundering prosecution that had collapsed when its primary witness recanted under circumstances that were never fully explained. The name was Richard Hale. And Richard Hale, according to the organizational chart she had found in the third subfolder 20 minutes ago, was currently the Moretti organization's chief financial operations director. He was, in other words, inside the house. Vivian set the phone down on the desk without ending the call. She could hear Marcus still talking, his voice coming from the speaker in a thin, pressurized stream. She stood up from the chair, carefully, and crossed to the door and opened it and looked into the corridor. Sal was at the end of the hall, leaning against the wall, phone in his hand. He looked up when she appeared. "I need to speak with Moretti," she said. "Right now, not in 10 minutes. Sal read something in her face and straightened up and reached for his radio. And behind her on the desk, Marcus's voice kept coming out of the phone, saying her name over and over into the empty room like he still had any power over what it meant. The name Richard Hale said was Senator Owen Draft. Vivian had 3 seconds to absorb it before Marco grabbed her arm. Not roughly, but with the urgent purposefulness of someone who had decided that standing still was no longer an option, and moved her toward the door. She pulled her arm back, not because she was refusing to move, because she needed to do one thing first. She picked up her phone from the desk. She opened the voice memo application. She pressed record. She set it face down on the desk next to Hale's hand. "Say it again," she said. "The name, and what you know about his involvement." Hale looked at the phone. He looked at her. Something in his face, the exhaustion, the calculation, the love for a 12-year-old girl in a house in Connecticut, resolved into something simpler. "Senator Owen Draft authorized the initial framework," he said, to the phone, to the room, to whatever came after this. "He has been using the Moretti organization's financial infrastructure as an involuntary vehicle for asset placement since approximately 30 months ago. He approached me through Meridian, through Sandra's firm. He needed a channel that had no federal oversight. He needed the channel to believe it was operating independently." He paused. "He picked Moretti because Moretti's organization is disciplined and solvent and runs clean enough that federal attention stays at a low level. He didn't want a chaotic operation. He wanted a stable one he could parasitize quietly." Another pause. The Marcus Mercer situation was designed to create a crisis event large enough to occupy Moretti's resources and attention for 6 to 12 months, long enough for Draft to complete a secondary transfer of assets he needed moved before the next election cycle. Vivian picked up the phone. She stopped the recording. She sent the file to an email address she had been using since her forensic accounting days, a server she paid for herself, not connected to any of Marcus's accounts, not connected to anything in this house. "How does he access the organization's infrastructure?" she said. "Through me. I'm the access point. All of it flows through you." "Yes." "Then you're the switch," she said. "If you cooperate, we can shut off his access and document every transaction he's moved through you. If you don't, I'll cooperate," he said. "I told you I'd cooperate." "Then we need you mobile. You can't be in this room when the marshals arrive." Marco was already moving. "There's a vehicle in the north garage. Plates are clean. Sal can drive." "Not Sal," Moretti said from the doorway. He had come in silently. She hadn't heard the door, hadn't heard him cross the corridor, and she registered that with a separate part of her brain that noted it and filed it under things she would think about later, when later existed. He was looking at Hale with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage, something more contained than rage, the kind of quiet that preceded a decision rather than followed one. "Richard," he said. Hale stood up. He stood up straight, which took something visible from him. "Damien, how long did you think it would hold?" "I didn't let myself think about that." Moretti was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter, she doesn't know." "No." "Keep it that way." He looked at Marco. "North vehicle. Take him to the Westchester property and keep him there. Nobody reaches him without my direct authorization." He looked at Hale one more time. "We're going to have a much longer conversation when this is over." Hale nodded. He looked briefly at Vivian. "The secondary account structure, the transfers Draft moved through the organization. There are records in a partition on the operations server, subdirectory R7. The password is my daughter's birthday, month, day, year. Go, Moretti said. Marco moved Hale out of the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had escorted people out of rooms under adverse circumstances before. Vivian was already back at the laptop, navigating to the operations server, finding subdirectory R7, typing the password. The partition opened. She had perhaps 12 minutes before federal marshals arrived. She worked in complete silence. Moretti stood behind her and watched and did not speak, and that was, she would think later, the right thing to do. Some situations required someone to stand behind you and not speak. She extracted every file in the partition, 43 documents, transaction records, communication logs, 2 video files whose thumbnails showed a man she recognized from news photographs sitting in a room that was not a Senate office having a conversation she could only imagine, and sent them to the same server where the voice memo had gone. Then she closed everything, cleared the browser history, closed the laptop. I need to not be here when they arrive, she said. I know. If I run, I look guilty. You look guilty if you stay. If I look guilty, the indictment moves forward, and I lose the ability to present any of this as a cooperating witness. She turned around in the chair. What I need is a federal attorney, not a defense attorney. A specific kind of federal attorney. Someone who has standing to approach the U.S. Attorney's Office directly with a cooperation package. She held his eyes. Do you have that? I have someone who has worked adjacent to that territory. Adjacent isn't enough. He's done it before. He was already reaching for his phone. It'll take 30 minutes to get him on the line. We don't have 30 minutes. Then we have what we have. He dialed. He walked to the window, his back to her, and she listened to him talk in a low, rapid voice that she could parse only partially. Names, a reference to a timeline, a single hard phrase that she did catch. Get moving or don't bother calling me again. He ended the call. 20 minutes. Vivian pressed her palm against her stomach. The baby was still. He was sleeping, she thought, or whatever the equivalent of sleeping was at this stage, this suspended internal quiet that she had learned to read as a different kind of presence than the rolling and pressing. Hale said something I need you to understand, she said. Moretti turned from the window. Draft didn't choose your organization randomly. He chose it because it's stable, because your operational discipline is high enough that you don't attract sustained federal attention. She watched his face. Which means someone gave him a detailed operational assessment of how you run things. Someone who had been inside long enough to evaluate it. The implication settled. Hale has been with me 7 years, Moretti said. Yes, but this started 30 months ago, which means the assessment was done before Hale was recruited by Draft. Or simultaneously. She paused. Who else would have that level of operational knowledge? He was very still. You need to think about that, she said. Not now, but before this is over. Tires on gravel, multiple vehicles. She heard it before he did, or maybe simultaneously, and they both looked toward the window and the sound clarified into the unmistakable pattern of government vehicles, heavier than civilian SUVs, moving with the unhurried authority of people who expected the gate to open. They're here, she said. The gate won't open for another 4 minutes. It's on a manual delay during security protocols. He crossed to the door. Come with me. He took her down 2 floors and through a corridor she hadn't seen, past the kitchen, through a utility room that smelled of laundry and cleaning products, into a space behind the south wall that had been framed out as an office extension and never fully finished. Bare concrete floor. Electrical conduit along the ceiling. A folding table with a laptop on it, and a secure telephone unit and a whiteboard covered in what appeared to be logistics diagrams. Operational room, she said, when we need it. He opened the laptop. Sit. She sat. He dialed the secure telephone, and this time she could hear both sides of the conversation because he put it on speaker and set it between them like something shared. The attorney's name was Philip Crane. His voice was 60 years old and had the specific texture of someone who had spent those years in rooms where the wrong word had serious consequences. He listened while Moretti outlined the situation in broad strokes. 3 minutes, no interruptions. And then he said 3 words. How good is it? Tell him, Moretti said. Vivian leaned toward the phone. 43 documents. A voice-recorded statement from a direct participant naming the primary architect. Transaction records tracing $23 million through the architect's access point inside this organization over a 22-month period with clear routing to entities connected to the architect's controlled accounts. She paused. And 2 video files that I haven't viewed yet, but that I have reason to believe show the architect in direct communication with the access point regarding the operation structure. Silence on the line. Then, "Who is the architect?" She told him. The silence this time was longer. "Mrs. Mercer," Crane said carefully. "You understand that making an accusation of this nature against a sitting senator without sufficient supporting documentation—" "The documentation is sufficient," she said. "I've been building federal fraud cases for 10 years. I know what sufficient looks like, and I know what incomplete looks like, and what I sent to my server an hour ago is sufficient. I'll need to review it. You'll have it in 40 minutes. I need something from you first." She kept her voice level. "There is currently a federal marshal vehicle on the grounds of this estate with a pickup order for me based on an indictment prepared using fraudulent corporate documentation that was filed in my name without my knowledge or consent. I need that order stayed while you review the cooperation package. If I am arrested and processed, I lose the evidentiary chain of custody for 2 of the 43 documents that are only accessible through my personal account credentials." It was not entirely true. It was true enough to be useful. Crane was quiet for 4 seconds. "Give me 45 minutes. You have 30. She heard something that might have been a dry exhale. "I'll call you back on this line." The call ended. Moretti was looking at her. "The documents only accessible through your credentials," he said. "Are fully accessible through my credentials," she said, "which I will have regardless of whether I'm arrested." She met his eyes. "I needed 45 minutes, and I got 30. Something moved in his face that she had not seen before. Not admiration. Something more restrained than that. Recognition, maybe. The particular look of someone seeing their own quality reflected in an unexpected direction. "There are marshals at my gate," he said. "Don't open it yet." "I can't legally." "You can cite a security verification protocol. Any private estate with documented threat assessments is permitted to delay entry for identity confirmation." She reached across and pulled the laptop toward her. 4 minutes? Maybe 6. He picked up the phone and made a call to whoever managed the gate. She heard him say, "Security verification delay. Confirm credentials before entry." She was already on the laptop, opening a legal database she had used for a decade, pulling the statute on cooperation agreements in federal fraud cases, looking for the specific provision she needed. She found it. She printed it using a wireless printer that appeared to be connected to the operational room's network. The thing hummed and produced a single page. And she clipped it with a binder clip she found in the folding table's single drawer and set it beside the phone. Then she heard footsteps above them. Heavy. Multiple sets. The marshals were inside the house. Moretti looked at the ceiling. He looked at her. "They'll find this room," she said. "Eventually." "How long?" "The entrance is behind the utility shelving. If they're not looking for it specifically—" He shrugged slightly. 15 minutes? Then we wait. They waited. She sat at the folding table and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and did the 4-count breathing and listened to the sounds of movement in the house above them. Footsteps traversing rooms, voices she couldn't make out, a door closing somewhere with more force than necessary. The baby moved. She put her hand on her stomach and felt the small shifting weight of him and thought about a 12-year-old girl in a house in Connecticut and a senator who had looked at a pregnant woman and decided she was a useful piece of theater, and a man in a villa in Rio who had proposed to her on a bridge in the rain and who she had loved, genuinely loved, in the way you loved something before you understood its full dimensions. She thought about the runway, the cold, the wrongly buttoned coat. She thought about page 19. The phone on the table rang at 26 minutes. Moretti answered and held it between them again. "I've reviewed the initial package," Crane said. "The transaction records alone constitute a predicate for a cooperation agreement. The voice recording is, it's significant." A pause. The video files. You viewed them. I did. Mrs. Mercer, the video files show Senator Draft in 3 separate meetings with Mr. Hale over a 16-month period. In the third meeting, which is time-stamped 14 months ago, Draft uses language that constitutes a direct instruction to expand the asset movement operation and specifically references he uses the phrase Mercer event by name approximately 8 months before Marcus Mercer approached the Moretti organization for a loan. Vivian's hands were flat on the table. He planned the default event 14 months in advance, she said. That appears to be the case. And Marcus. The third video also contains a reference to, I'm reading directly, the accountant wife, who will provide sufficient legal exposure to keep Moretti's attorneys occupied for no less than 8 months. End quote. Another pause. Mrs. Mercer, I'm sorry. She didn't say anything for a moment. They had chosen her specifically, not as Marcus's available wife, not as incidental collateral. They had assessed her history, her profile, her specific capacity to look guilty in a way that would be difficult to quickly disprove. And they had chosen her. Draft had known she was a forensic accountant. He had known it and decided that her professional history would make the fraud charges more believable, not less, because prosecutors would assume she'd used her expertise for personal gain. Her own skill set had been weaponized against her. The pickup order, Moretti said. I've been on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the last 11 minutes, Crane said. The order is stayed pending review of the cooperation package. You have 72 hours before it reinstates, during which time Mrs. Mercer is required to remain in the country and available for interview. A pause. There will be federal agents on the grounds. That cannot be avoided, but she will not be arrested tonight. Draft, Vivian said. Has anyone? No one has approached him. That decision will be made at a level above me and above the U.S. Attorney's Office. Crane's voice was careful. A sitting senator requires a different procedure, but the material you've provided will reach the appropriate people within the hour. He'll run, she said. If he hears anything, people at his level don't run, Crane said. They lawyer up, and they strategize, and they call in favors. Running is for people who don't have 40 years of institutional relationships. A dry pause. It's also much harder to do when your passport access has been flagged, which is something I've taken the liberty of arranging. She exhaled. Philip, Moretti said. The 85 million. That's a separate conversation and a longer one, but given the nature of the cooperation package and the fact that the default event was manufactured rather than organic, I would expect that conversation to resolve in your favor. Moretti looked at the ceiling. He looked at the phone. He looked at Vivian. She was already thinking about the next problem. Marcus, she said, Rio. The Brazilian situation is outside my jurisdiction. I know, that's not your problem. She looked at Moretti. Is your team still watching the villa? Yes. Carla Donato may have contacted Marcus in the last 2 hours. She'll have learned, through whatever channel connects her to Draft's operation, that the situation here is moving. She'll try to warn him. She pulled the laptop back. He'll try to move the offshore accounts. He can't. You said you already... I identified them. I haven't frozen them yet. I was waiting until I had the full cooperation agreement in place so the freeze order has federal backing. She was already navigating. I need to do that now, before he moves anything. Do it. It requires your authorization for the 3 accounts that were originally Moretti Organization funds. She turned the laptop to face him. Here, here, and here. Signature authentication. He leaned over the laptop and entered his credentials with the particular speed of someone who had decided to stop deliberating and was simply executing. 3 accounts. 3 confirmations. She initiated the freeze orders. The laptop showed 3 green confirmation banners in sequence. The accounts containing Moretti's $85 million were now locked. Marcus Mercer, in his villa in Rio, had just lost access to his exit fund. She imagined him trying the accounts and finding them frozen. She imagined his face. She felt nothing that she was proud of in that imagining, but she felt it anyway. A cold, bright, specific satisfaction that she decided to allow herself because she had been 6 months pregnant on a runway in 11-degree weather, and she had earned it. "The villa," she said. Moretti's phone was already at his ear. She listened to him issue instructions in the clipped, abbreviated language of someone giving orders to people who needed minimum context. A location, a timing, a set of operational parameters that boiled down to 3 words she heard clearly at the end of the call. Bring him back. He ended the call. Above them, the footsteps had settled into a different pattern. No longer searching, but positioned. Federal agents finding places to stand and wait. She could hear them through the concrete in the low, steady vibration of people present and alert, but not moving. "There's something else," Moretti said. She looked up from the laptop. "The person who gave Draft the operational assessment," he said, "who had been inside long enough to evaluate how we run things." He set his phone down on the table. "I thought about it." She waited. "6 years ago, I brought in an outside security consultant," he said. "Standard practice when we were restructuring the operational side. The consultant spent 4 months inside the organization. Full access." He paused. The firm he worked for was a private security advisory company called Stonebridge Group. She knew the name. It was sitting in her memory from somewhere specific. She reached for it and found it, a reference in a federal case file she had reviewed during the Chicago money laundering prosecution 6 years ago. Stonebridge Group had been mentioned in the defendant's financial records as a payment recipient, just like Halverson Associates. She had flagged it and then seen the flag cleared by the same authenticated review firm, the same firm that had cleared Halverson. "Stonebridge Group," she said slowly. "Who owned it?" Moretti's jaw tightened. "At the time, a man named Franklin Cross. He's retired now, out of the industry." "Where is he?" "He sits on a foundation board in Washington, D.C. Moretti's eyes were very still. "Owen Draft's foundation." The room went completely quiet. She heard herself breathing. She heard the electrical conduit above them clicking as the building's heating system moved through its cycle. She heard distantly someone above them speaking into a radio. "Draft has been building this for 6 years," she said. "At least. He spent 2 years assessing your operation through Stonebridge. Then he recruited Hale. Then he recruited Carla Donato. Then he recruited Marcus." She laid it out flatly, each piece in sequence. He built a 6-year architecture using people who all thought they were operating independently. Hale thought he was running a personal skimming operation. Donato thought she was serving Hale. Marcus thought he was serving himself. She looked at her hands, and each of them was a layer, a buffer between Draft and the money. Until you. Until me. She looked up. "I'm the first person in this chain who wasn't recruited. I was placed, like a piece of furniture." The flatness in her voice was fraying at the edges now, and she let it, just slightly. "He put a pregnant woman in the center of his architecture because pregnant women make good victims and good scapegoats, and they're easy to underestimate." She felt her jaw tighten. That was his mistake. Not the only one, but the one I'm going to make sure he regrets specifically. Moretti looked at her across the folding table in the unfinished room with the bare concrete floor and the electrical conduit and the whiteboard covered in logistics diagrams. And she looked back at him, and for a moment the situation was stripped of everything peripheral. The federal agents upstairs, the $85 million in frozen accounts, the villa in Rio, the senator in Washington. And what was left was 2 people who had both been used and were now, from different directions and for different reasons, committed to the same ending. "The cooperation agreement," he said, "when you testify." "I'm going to need everything," she said. "Every document, everything we have, whatever your team brings back from Rio." She pressed her palm flat on the table. "And I need one more thing." "What?" "I need Marcus on a live call, before your people take him anywhere." She held his gaze. "I need him to see my face when he realizes what I've done." Something shifted in Moretti's expression. Not softness, something more complicated than that. He reached across the table, slowly, and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and heavy, and she did not pull away. "You'll have it," he said. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Brazilian country code. She stared at it. It buzzed again. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Marcus. It was a woman. Low, controlled, speaking with the particular cadence of someone relaying information rather than having a conversation. "Mrs. Mercer," the woman said, "my name is Tessa Park. I'm calling from Rio de Janeiro." A pause. Mr. Mercer asked me to call you. He wants you to know that whatever you're doing with the accounts. Another pause. Something in the background that she couldn't identify. He says to tell you he's sorry. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. He's sorry, she repeated. Yes. Tell him, she said carefully, that sorry is a word people use when they've run out of options. She looked at Moretti across the table. And that I've made sure he's run out of options. She ended the call. Upstairs, a door opened. Footsteps, deliberate, headed somewhere specific, coming toward the south side of the house. They were going to find the utility room. Moretti stood up. He straightened his jacket in the single, practiced movement of a man who had spent 20 years presenting himself to adversarial situations with his posture exactly right. Ready, he said. She stood up. She gathered the printed statute, the legal pad, and her phone. She was 6 months pregnant and she had not slept more than 3 hours, and she had been awake for 18 consecutive hours doing the most sustained and consequential forensic work of her professional life, and her feet hurt, and her lower back was a long, low complaint, and her eyes felt like someone had rubbed sand into them. She was also, she recognized, with a clarity that surprised her, not afraid. The footsteps stopped outside the utility room. Vivian straightened up to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and looked at the entrance behind the shelving and waited for it to open. The shelving unit swung inward on a pivot mechanism she hadn't noticed, and the 2 federal agents who came through the opening were not what she expected. Not aggressive, not tactical, moving with the careful deliberateness of people who had been briefed on a delicate situation and were trying not to make it worse. The first one was a woman, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, a badge clipped to her belt. She looked at Vivian and then at Moretti and then at the folding table with the laptop and the phone and the printed statute, and she did a very good job of keeping her face neutral. Mrs. Mercer, she said, I'm Special Agent Dana Rice. I'm going to need you to come upstairs. I'm aware, Vivian said. My attorney has spoken with the U.S. Attorney's Office within the last 30 minutes regarding a cooperation package. The pickup order has been stayed pending review. She held out the printed statute. This is the relevant provision. Philip Crane is available by phone to confirm. Rice took the paper. She read it. She looked at her partner, a younger man standing slightly behind her right shoulder who was doing his best not to look at Vivian's stomach and not entirely succeeding. Rice handed the paper back without taking it, which was not a concession, but was not an escalation either. I'll need to verify that, Rice said. Of course. Vivian gestured toward the stairs. Shall we go somewhere with better light? What? They spent 2 hours in the estate's main sitting room, a space that felt strange under fluorescent work lights the agents had brought in, stripping it of whatever domestic character it normally held and turning it into something functional and temporary. Rice made calls. Her partner, whose name was Garfield, sat near the window and took notes on a legal pad and said almost nothing. Moretti sat in a chair near the fireplace and spoke when spoken to, and otherwise maintained the particular stillness of a man who had decided the most useful thing he could do was take up as little space as possible. Philip Crane arrived in person at 11:47 at night, which told Vivian more about the gravity of the situation than any of the phone calls had. He was a smaller man than she'd imagined from his voice, compact, gray-suited, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent attentiveness. He shook her hand and looked at her with the eyes of someone assessing structural damage, and then he sat down next to her and opened a briefcase, and they got to work. The cooperation agreement took until 2 in the morning. She did not get everything she wanted. She got most of it. The indictment against her was formally suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation, with a complete dismissal contingent on her testimony and the authentication of the documentary evidence. Her passport flag was lifted. The criminal charges associated with Mercer Capital Holdings were formally separated from any personal liability, with documentation confirming the fraudulent transfer of corporate ownership into her name. The $85 million in frozen offshore accounts would be subject to asset recovery proceedings in which the Moretti organization was listed as the primary aggrieved party, meaning the money would go back to Moretti, not to the federal government, which was the outcome Crane had spent 40 minutes negotiating and which Rice had spent 35 minutes resisting before a call from someone above her pay grade settled the question. Vivian signed the agreement at 2:17 in the morning. Her hand was steady. She noticed that and was grateful for it. The call from Rio came at 4:51. She was in the East office again, alone this time, the federal agents having established a perimeter presence that was nominally about her protection and practically about monitoring her movements, which she had decided to find acceptable rather than fight. She had been trying to sleep on the office couch for 2 hours and had not slept. She was lying on her side with her coat folded under her head as a pillow when the phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen and saw the word she'd been waiting for. Rio. Confirmed. She sat up. She called the number Moretti's team had given her. The connection took 12 seconds to establish, long enough that she had time to set her feet flat on the floor and straighten her back and decide what her face was going to do. She had thought about this moment for, she counted, approximately 31 hours since the runway. She had been thinking about it in the way you thought about something you needed to be ready for, turning it over, testing different versions of herself against it. She had decided she was not going to perform anything. The screen filled with a video image, a room she didn't recognize, white walls, tile floors, the particular flat light of a space designed for functionality rather than comfort. Marcus was sitting in a chair that had been placed in the center of the room. His hands were in his lap. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing in the one photograph she'd seen of him from the past week, a pale blue shirt, no jacket, and they were creased in the way of clothes that had been slept in. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Viv," he said. "Don't," she said. Just that. He closed his mouth. She looked at his face. She had loved this face. She had woken up next to it for 3 years and trusted the things it expressed and believed the things it said and organized a significant portion of her life around its proximity. She looked at it now and tried to locate what she felt and found something she didn't have a clean word for. Not hatred, which was too hot and too simple, and not grief, which implied something that was over, more like a long, total recognition. The face of a person fully seen after having been imperfectly known. "The accounts are frozen," she said. "All of them. Including the secondary pool you started building 3 months after you proposed to me." She watched him. "The one you thought I didn't know about." His jaw moved. "The corporate entities are being unwound. The fraudulent filings are documented and reversed. The federal charges in my name are suspended." She held the phone steady with both hands. "Your cooperating witnesses, the 2 people who are going to testify against me, have been interviewed in the last 6 hours regarding their own knowledge of how those charges were constructed. They are no longer cooperating witnesses. They are persons of interest." "Vivian," his voice was rough. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Tell me when it was supposed to stop," she said. "At what point did your plan include me being all right?" He didn't answer. "Draft recruited you 26 months ago," she said. "You came home from that first meeting. I'm calculating. The weekend you took me to Connecticut to look at houses. You told me it was a scouting trip. You were enthusiastic. You held my hand in the car." She kept her voice level. Flat. The flatness was not costing her anything anymore because she had spent it all and was now on the other side of it. Was any of it real? "Yes," he said, immediately, with a force that surprised her. "You were real. Whatever you think. You were real. But not real enough to warn me." He looked at his hands. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could get out clean without me being arrested for your crimes. Without anyone being hurt. Marcus." She said his name with the complete tiredness of someone who had been arguing with a person in their head for 31 hours and was finished with it. Someone was always going to be hurt. The system you agreed to participate in required a human being in the center of it who would absorb the legal exposure so everyone else could walk away. Draft told you that. Hale told you that. Carla Donato drafted the mechanism that made it legally functional. She paused. "And you picked me. You picked the woman who was carrying your son." His face did something then that she had not seen it do before. Not the practiced expressions she had learned to read over 3 years. The charm, the confidence, the particular warmth he deployed when he needed something. Something that was not managed, something that came from a depth she hadn't known he had access to, or perhaps had not been able to reach while the machinery of his plan was still running and requiring his attention. He looked for approximately 4 seconds like a man who understood the full weight of what he had done. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "Tessa told me." She ended the call. She set the phone on the desk and sat in the silence of the East office at 4:58 in the morning and breathed for a while. The baby moved. Not the slow rolling motion, but something more definite, a clear and purposeful pressure that she'd learned meant he was awake and oriented, responding to something in her body chemistry. The particular cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol and something else, something that didn't have a medical name, that her body had been producing for 31 hours. "I know," she said again, to the room, to the pressure under her ribs. "We're okay." She wasn't entirely sure that was true yet. She said it anyway. Senator Owen Draft was arrested at 6:20 in the morning at his Georgetown residence. She learned this from Crane, who called it 7:03 with the particular controlled energy of someone who had been awake all night watching something they had helped build reach its conclusion. He gave her the information in sequence: the arrest, the charges, the preliminary asset freeze on Draft's personal and foundation accounts, the simultaneous action against Franklin Cross, the Stonebridge Group's founding partner, who was taken into custody at an airport in Virginia, apparently in the process of boarding a flight to Zurich. "Carla Donato," she said. "Montreal. Canadian authorities have her. Extradition will take time, but the process has started." A pause. "She's asking to cooperate." "Tell whoever is handling her that her cooperation is most useful if it's complete and immediate," Vivian said. "She knows the full internal structure of how Draft communicated with his contractors. That's the piece that makes the federal case airtight rather than merely strong." "I will convey that." Richard Hale. In custody as of an hour ago. He turned himself in voluntarily, which his attorney will use to argue for a reduced sentence and which will probably work. Crane's voice was dry. "The house in Westport is protected under the terms of the cooperation agreement. His daughter won't be affected." She had not forgotten that she'd promised to try. She was glad it had held. "Marcus Mercer," she said, "that situation is more complicated. He's in Brazilian custody currently. Extradition is possible but slow. The charges against him are substantial and will only become more so as the full investigation develops." A pause. "He has requested through his attorney to provide a cooperation statement." "He should." "His attorney has asked whether there is any possibility of—" Crane stopped, started again. "He wants to know if you would speak with him again before he decides to cooperate formally." She was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't need my permission to do the right thing," she said, "and I'm not in the business of making it easier for him." She looked at the window. The sky outside was doing something tentative. The first gray differentiation between dark and light, the day deciding whether to begin. "But tell his attorney that if he provides a full and unredacted statement, I won't oppose a reduction in his sentence." She paused. "He has a son coming. He should think about that." She ended the call. 3 months later, she was in a hospital room in Manhattan when Daniel James Mercer decided to arrive, 6 days ahead of schedule, in the manner of someone who had been waiting long enough and had made a unilateral decision about it. Labor was 14 hours. She had been told it would be longer, first pregnancies usually were, but Daniel had his own timeline, and he kept it. Sal drove her to the hospital at 3 in the morning because he had been assigned to her protection detail and had been doing it with the stoic consistency of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it correctly. And he sat in the waiting room for 14 hours drinking bad coffee and not complaining about it. Damien arrived at hour 9. He came in without ceremony, walked through the door of the labor and delivery room and stood inside it for a moment, as if assessing whether he was permitted to be there, which was not a quality she had previously associated with him. He was holding a paper cup of coffee that he'd apparently gotten from somewhere, and he looked at her and she looked at him and she said, without preamble, because she was 6 centimeters dilated and had been awake for 11 hours and had no energy left for anything indirect, "You can stay or you can go. Either is fine." He stayed. He sat in the chair near the window, and he did not try to hold her hand or coach her breathing or say any of the things that people said in these situations, which she was grateful for. He was simply present in the way he was present in most situations, with a quality of settled attention that communicated that he was not going anywhere and was not requiring anything from her in return. At hour 14, Daniel arrived. He arrived with the full commitment of someone entering a room for the first time and finding it acceptable. Loud, immediate, entirely himself from the first second. She held him and looked at his face and understood, in a way that bypassed language entirely, that whatever the previous 31 hours and 90 days and 3 years had cost her, the arithmetic of it came out to this exact weight in her arms, this specific face. She looked up and found Damien watching from the chair by the window. His expression was the one she had learned to read as the unguarded version, the face he wore when he had decided not to manage what was showing. "He's healthy," the nurse said, which was the most important sentence in the room. "Yes," Vivian said. "He is." Bab. The federal trial of Owen Draft began 7 months after his arrest. Vivian testified for 3 days. She had testified in federal court before, 4 times, as an expert witness, with the particular detachment of someone whose role was to explain financial systems to people who needed them explained. This was different. She was not an expert witness. She was a material witness, a cooperating party, a woman who sat in the chair and told the truth about what she had found and when she had found it and what it had cost her to find it. She was asked on the second day by Draft's defense attorney, a man named Holloway, who had the smooth, aggressive energy of someone who had won cases he shouldn't have won and expected to win this one, whether she had any personal motivation to misrepresent the evidence. She looked at him across the courtroom. "I have a personal motivation to represent it accurately," she said. "I was selected as a scapegoat by the defendant because he believed my profile. A pregnant woman with a fraudulent corporate history in her name would be sufficient to redirect federal attention away from his operation. He was wrong." She kept her eyes on Holloway. "My personal motivation is to make sure the record reflects exactly what happened and exactly who decided it should happen. That's not misrepresentation. That's precision." Holloway moved on to another question. Draft was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. Sentencing was 6 weeks after the verdict. She did not attend the sentencing. She was at a park in Brooklyn with Daniel, who was 4 months old and had recently discovered that his hands existed, and who was currently holding both of them up in front of his face with the absorbed concentration of a scientist examining something unprecedented. She got the news from Crane by text. 22 years, no parole consideration for 12. FC got 14. CD got 6 with cooperation credit. RM. Extradition finalized, trial date TBD. She read the text and put her phone back in her pocket and looked at her son examining his hands. 22 years, she told him, not because he understood and not because she needed to say it to anyone in particular, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way that reading it didn't. That's what it cost. Daniel looked at his hands. Richard Hale received 4 years. His sentencing recommendation, filed by the federal prosecutor, noted his early and complete cooperation and his willingness to provide testimony that had been central to the convictions of both Draft and Cross. The house in Westport stayed in the trust. His daughter was 14 by the time he would be eligible for release. Vivian thought about that sometimes. Not with sympathy exactly, and not with its absence. With the complicated recognition that people who built destructive things were still people, and that the damage radiated outward in ways that the person at the center of it didn't always fully calculate until the accounting came due. She thought about Marcus too, in the way you thought about something that had been significant and was now resolved. His extradition was finalized 5 months after Draft's sentencing. He pled guilty to 12 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy, a deal that Crane had helped negotiate in exchange for a full cooperation statement that had contributed meaningfully to the federal case. His sentence was 9 years. He would be in his mid-40s when he got out. He had asked, through his attorney, about Daniel, whether he could receive photographs, whether there was any possibility of eventual contact. She thought about that for 2 weeks before she answered. She answered yes. Not to visits. Daniel was too young and the situation was too raw, and she was not, she knew with clear-eyed honesty, anywhere near the version of herself that could manage that conversation yet. But photographs, yes. Updates, yes. The record of a child growing up in the knowledge that he existed and was loved and was safe, sent to a man who had made the worst possible choices and who would live with them in a room with a small window for 9 years. She did not do it for Marcus. She did it because Daniel was going to grow up and ask questions, and when he did, she wanted the answers she gave him to be ones she could stand behind completely. The Moretti organization changed in the year after the federal investigation concluded. It changed because it had to. The exposure, the knowledge that it had been used as an unwitting vehicle for a senator's asset laundering operation for 30 months, was not the kind of thing that could be absorbed without consequence. There were relationships to rebuild and structures to audit and a legal framework to reassess from the foundation up. Vivian did the audit, not because anyone asked her to and not because she was obligated to. The cooperation agreement was satisfied, her role in the federal case was complete, she was legally and practically free to take Daniel and establish herself anywhere she chose. She did it because the work was in front of her, and she was the most qualified person to do it. And because somewhere in the previous months, she had arrived at the recognition that her future and Moretti's future had become entangled in a way that she did not want to cut through, but wanted, carefully, to understand. She worked in the East office again. She worked long hours, and she worked with the same precision she had brought to the crisis, except that the crisis was over, and what remained was slower and more structural, and in some ways more satisfying, building something stable rather than dismantling something corrupt. Damien worked alongside her in the way he had worked alongside her since the beginning, present, attentive, not crowding. He had a quality she had come to value that was rare in people with significant power. He did not need to be the smartest person in the room. He was comfortable with her being the one who understood the numbers, and she was comfortable with him being the one who understood the people, and between those two competencies they covered most of the territory that needed covering. They did not talk about what they were to each other for a long time. It existed between them the way certain things existed, not requiring definition, because the definition was already functionally present in the daily accumulation of shared work and shared space and the specific particular ease that developed between two people who had been through something significant and had come out the other side still choosing to be in the same room. It was Damien who said it first, which surprised her, not in the way of a declaration, not with formality or ceremony. They were in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, Daniel in a bouncy chair on the table between them producing small determined sounds at a wooden toy, and Damien was reading something on his tablet and she was on her second coffee, and the light was coming through the windows in the flat gray way of a February morning that hadn't decided yet whether to be cold or merely overcast. "I want you to stay," he said, to his tablet. He did not look up. She looked at him. He looked up. His face was doing the unguarded thing. "Not as a guest," he said. "Not as a consultant. Not as—" He stopped. The particular precision he usually brought to language was failing him slightly, which she found she appreciated. "I want you to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a runway, a wrongly buttoned coat, a black SUV and a man who had gotten out of it and offered her a choice between two bad options, and who had, in the months since, proven himself to be something she had not expected and had not planned for, and had not, if she was being honest with herself in the clear-eyed way she tried to be, been able to stop wanting. "Daniel stays too," she said, "obviously. And I work. I wouldn't, He stopped again. "Of course. And there are going to be things I find in the financial structure of this organization that are going to require changes you won't like." His jaw shifted slightly. "Probably. And I'll make those changes anyway." He held her gaze. "I know." She picked up her coffee. She looked at Daniel, who had succeeded in getting the wooden toy into his mouth and appeared satisfied with this development. "Okay," she said. She did not say it with the warmth of a romantic scene or the resolution of a story wrapping itself into a ribbon. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without excess, meaning exactly what she said. "Okay. Yes. I'm staying." Damien looked back at his tablet, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that had changed, a release of something that had been held there, probably for longer than she knew. She drank her coffee. Daniel worked on his toy. Outside, the February morning finally decided to be cold, and the windows showed a sky that was moving towards something. The last thread resolved itself on a Tuesday in March, in a way she had not anticipated. She was in a meeting with Crane, routine, the final paperwork on the corporate dissolution of Mercer Capital Holdings, when her phone showed a notification from the federal case management system she still had access to. She looked at it under the table while Crane talked. The notification was an evidence update, a routine filing. New materials submitted to the court record in the draft case as part of the post-conviction discovery process. The new material was a document she had not seen before, a planning document, apparently recovered from Draft's encrypted personal server during a forensic review that had been ongoing since his arrest. The document was dated 32 months ago. It was a list, names with notations beside each one, risk assessments she recognized, the kind of document someone produced when they were evaluating the components of an operation and grading each one for reliability and exposure. She scrolled down. Her name was 7th on the list. Beside her name in Draft's own notation style was a single line, Mercer wife, forensic background, potential liability if activated, recommend passive placement only, do not engage directly. She read it twice. He had known she was a risk. He had specifically assessed her as a potential liability and decided that the solution was to keep her passive, to make her a piece of scenery in his operation rather than a participant, so that her skills would never be activated in a direction that threatened him. He had been right that she was a risk. He had been wrong that she could be kept passive. She put her phone back under the table and looked at Crane, who had finished talking and was looking at her with the attentive expression of someone who had noticed her attention had been elsewhere. "Sorry," she said. "Go ahead." He went ahead. The paperwork concluded. She signed where she was asked to sign. On the way back through the building's lobby, she stopped at the window that looked out onto the street. March had arrived with more conviction than February. There was actual light in it, thin and tentative but present, the specific quality of early spring light that was not warm yet but was trying. She looked at the street for a moment. She thought about the woman who had stood on a runway 32 weeks ago with her coat buttoned wrong, watching a jet disappear into the clouds, not yet knowing the full dimensions of what she had been put inside. That woman had been frightened in a way that she had not allowed herself to feel at the time, because feeling it would have been disabling, and she could not afford to be disabled. She had compressed it and filed it and run on adrenaline and precision and the specific fuel of a very focused anger. That woman was still inside her. She did not think she would ever fully be past her. The things that had been done, the forged signature, the emptied accounts, the stolen passport, the manufactured charges, the runway in the cold, did not become undone because they were resolved. They became part of the record, part of the material she was made of now, denser than before, heavier in some places, but also more specific. She knew things about herself she had not known before. She knew she could work through the night with a hand on her stomach and a rage she kept flat and controlled and directed like water through a narrow channel. She knew she could walk into a room full of men who thought they knew exactly who she was and dismantle everything they had built while they were still deciding whether she was a threat. She knew she was a threat. It was good information to have about yourself. She buttoned her coat, correctly all the way up, collar even on both sides, and walked out into the March light and called Sal and told him she was ready and went home. Daniel was awake when she got there, in the particular alert and opinionated state he occupied for several hours each afternoon. Damien was holding him in the kitchen with the slightly careful posture of someone who was still calibrating the weight and unpredictability of a 4-month-old. He looked up when she came in. She hung up her coat. She washed her hands. She crossed the kitchen and took Daniel from him, and Daniel looked at her face with the direct and unself-conscious focus of someone for whom her face was still one of the primary facts of the world. And she looked back at him, and the kitchen was warm, and the light through the windows was doing its tentative March thing, and somewhere on the other side of a body of water, a man was sitting in a room thinking about the choices he had made. And in a federal penitentiary, a senator was beginning to understand the long arithmetic of consequences. And the woman who had been placed on a runway like a piece of furniture in someone else's plan was standing in a kitchen holding her son. She was not the woman who had been placed there. She was not the frightened, wrongly buttoned woman watching the jet disappear. She was something that woman had not yet known she could become. Built from the same material, same hands, same mind, same specific capacity for precision and fury and love, but tempered now in a way that changed what she was capable of and changed more permanently. What anyone who looked at her and thought they understood what they were seeing would find when they found out they were wrong. The baby pressed his small, open hand against her collarbone. She put her hand over his.